Good afternoon and welcome to R Street. I'm Sabrina Schaefer, Vice President of Public Affairs. Since September, we've had the privilege of hosting a series of events under the banner of America 250 Conversations, bringing together a diverse group of speakers to reflect on the ideas, institutions, and individuals that have shaped the American experiment. It's been a remarkable series covering everything from the intellectual foundations of the founding to the evolving role of leadership in American public life. And we've been fortunate to welcome a slate of thoughtful and engaging guests along the way. Today's conversation is our last in the series, but in no way less impressive, and we couldn't think of a more fitting note to end on. As we look forward to the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which is right around the corner now, we see this moment not just as a celebration, but as an opportunity to reflect more deeply on what sustains a free and pluralistic society. And few topics are more central to that reflection than the role of dissent. From the founding era to today, protest has been a defining feature of American life, driving reform, expanding rights, and at times testing the limits of our institutions. So this afternoon, we're asking, what role should dissent play in a healthy democracy? Where are its boundaries? And what makes protest effective and what makes it backfire? So I'm delighted to be joined by an outstanding panel this afternoon. I'll start by introducing Professor Laura Walls, who is a distinguished scholar of American literature and thought, and one of the leading experts on Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and 19th century American transcendentalism. She is Professor Emerita in English at Notre Dame University, and her work explores the intellectual and moral traditions that have shaped American ideas of dissent, individual conscience, and civic responsibility. Among many books, she is the author of Henry David Thoreau, A Life, published by the University of Chicago Press in July of 2017, just in time for Thoreau's then 200th birthday. Also with us is Ilya Shapiro. He's a constitutional scholar and commentator whose work focuses on principles underlying the First Amendment, the rule of law, and the boundaries of free expression in a pluralistic society. He's a senior fellow and director of constitutional studies at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of City Journal. Ilya is also the author of many books. Most recently, he completed Lawless, the Miseducation of America's Elites, which I see in the background there. And Jill Snyder is a senior fellow with the Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties program here at the R Street Institute, where she focuses on all stages of the criminal justice system, building on her knowledge as a retired New York City police officer. She's currently a doctoral candidate in criminal justice with a concentration in behavioral science, giving her added perspective on modern protest movements, including how they're organized, how they operate, and what makes them effective or counterproductive. In her extra time, Jill also teaches at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. So with that, thank you all for being here. I'm looking forward to a thoughtful discussion. Let's jump right in. Laura, I'm going to start with you. The American founding involved acts of dissent, petitions, boycotts, rebellion, the Tea Party, and eventually, of course, a revolution. So to what extent is protest not just a feature of American democracy, but foundational to it?
Sure. Well, I don't think America is conceivable without protest. You could, if you really want to get into deep history, go all the way back to the Protestant Reformation, to Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the church door. And of course, the fundamental question there is the individual's right to choose, which is a right that the Puritans exerted when they colonized the new lands to the in the Americas or in North America, and so we call them our founders, the Pilgrims. And of course, the American Revolution looked back to that founding gesture, breakaway gesture of protest, and again, the sense that they had the right to assert their own vision of a polity and of a religious community. So the American Revolution, gosh, I remember phrases like no taxation without representation being key to the sort of early beginning of revolutionary stirrings. The Boston Tea Party, 1773, dumping the tea in Boston Harbor to protest a tea tax. Tom Paine's Common Sense, which is kind of the classic uniting us in grievance towards a revolution. Incredibly effective piece of protest writing. All of this is a direct lead in to Henry David Thoreau, my own specialty, and the background there goes to the religious foundation of sort of the New England's liberalizing churches, which led to transcendentalism, the sort of far, far left of that movement. And Thoreau was a transcendentalist, card carrying. And of course, tied in closely and inseparable with the abolitionist movement, the protests against slavery and against an economy based on slave labor. So, in all these ways, I think that America is inseparable from protest, and it creates the fundamental problem of America, which is how to hold together contending peoples in a single union.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Ilya, I think this is a great place to bring you in because if we're going to start with the founding, we have to think about the Constitution. And so, from a constitutional perspective, the First Amendment offers very strong protections for speech, even speech that we might find offensive. What are the core principles that define those protections, and where does the Constitution draw the line when it comes to protest and dissent?
Yeah, thanks for that's a good question, and thanks for bringing me into this group. Of course, we're celebrating the 250th of the Declaration, as you said, not the Constitution. The Constitution wouldn't be sent out for another 11 years and ratified 2 years after that. Um, so originally we had the Articles of Confederation, and that broke down for various ways. In the Constitution, specifically the Bill of Rights, which was 2 years after the Constitution, we've had the First Amendment apply in different ways over our history, and for a long time, it didn't apply to state censorship, for example. All of the Bill of Rights only applied to the federal government. But generally, the way things have broken down. There are things that are not speech, which even if they have an expressive element or motivation, are not protected. So if you assault somebody or vandalize a building out of whether it be political, artistic, or other kind of expression of motivation, that's not a get out of jail free card. The most colorful example of this in some recent protests after October 7th, somebody urinated on a Hillel, a Jewish student organization building. I forget which university, and they were arrested for public urination and something else. And they said, "Well, no, I'm just expressing my displeasure at what goes on here." Well, sorry, no, that's not protected. Then there's speech that is not protected. So incitement of violence or what's called a true threat, if you issue a true death threat against somebody or something like that. And there is a long established jurisprudence of what exactly that is. What is incitement of violence? It has to be specific, it has to be imminent, there has to be a call to action, things like this. And then there are what's called time, place, and manner regulations. I can't, if you think that the core of the First Amendment, whether the right to speech, whether the right to assemble to express your grievances is, political speech about our rulers, about our government, and yet I can't go into your neighborhood at 2 in the morning and with a bullhorn tell you exactly what I think of Donald Trump or Governor Spanberger or whoever it is. That's disturbing the peace. Similarly, I want to protest something. I want to express my views. I can't just block the street downtown. That's why we have permits for parades, for demonstrations, and other things. So those three things to keep in mind, things that are simply not speech, speech that's not protected, and then speech that can be regulated through proper time, place, and manner, whether we're talking in general or in the last few years, we've talked a lot about campus issues that have arisen, but those are really the three delineations that are important to keep in mind.
That's very helpful context, and I think it's a good segue. Jill, I want to get your input here. Protests we often think of as both a catalyst for reform, but also the sort of stress test for democracy. And Ilya sort of referenced that. When you look across American history, do you see those as competing functions, or are they a tension that we can live with?
So, I actually like to push back a little on the ideas that they're two separate things. To me, they're the same, just looked at through different lenses and angles. I think the framing of this webinar gets at something really important, which is that we're at a moment where Americans don't disagree about policy. They disagree about whether dissent itself is legitimate. So there's a pretty striking thing to say about a country that was, and in a lot of ways, founded on dissent. So here's how I think about it. Protest is one of the clearest signals a democracy gives off about its own health. When people are out in the streets, they're telling us something. They're telling us through formal channels, elections, the courts, and the legislature. They're not moving fast enough. We aren't hearing them, or they just aren't seen as legitimate options for whatever grievances they're carrying. So protest ends up being a catalyst precisely because it stress tests the system. So the catalyst function and the stress test function aren't fighting each other. The stress is what produces the reform or the change that people are seeking. So where it does get complicated, and this is where I think, excuse me, I think my law enforcement experience really comes in. It's not that every stress test ends in reform. How institutions respond to the stress determines whether the next round of protests is more constructive or more destructive. So it's really dynamic. Protest, it tests democracy, and democracy's response shapes the next wave of protests. So I think of it as a feedback loop, and we're all a part of it.
Oh, that's a fascinating framework. And we're going to get more into some of the more contemporary protests in a few minutes, but I want to stick with some historical context for a little longer. Professor Walls, these America 250 conversations have really been an opportunity for us to explore some of these contemporary questions or challenges with a historical lens. So I want to talk a little bit about Henry David Thoreau. He's often seen as the bridge between the founding generation and the modern protest movement. And yet, as you've noted, he was drawing on a tradition that was already distinctly American. He didn't invent civil disobedience, but maybe he helped crystallize it. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how his notion of civil disobedience built on that earlier American tradition of dissent that you were talking about a few minutes ago.
Sure. I think the most relevant instance, well, going to the early 1800s, the liberalizing of American religion in Protestant religion in New England through the foundation of the Unitarian movement, which brings in a minister who founded Unitarianism as, again, a protest against religious orthodoxy. And this is William Ellery Channing, the Reverend William Ellery Channing, who was very clear during the War of 1812. He came out with a lecture and published widely on the duties of the citizen in times of trial or danger. And he laid out the statement: when a government becomes an engine of oppression, and that mechanical word, engine of oppression, the scripture enjoins subjection no longer. So, in other words, and he elaborates on this throughout the rest of his lifetime, when the citizen is called upon to do what his conscience clearly pronounces wrong, he must not obey. He must not waver. And it wasn't a matter of kind of like, you could go along if you chose, but, maybe no, it was an obligation, a moral obligation of the citizen. So there are other examples. This was not just unique to Channing. The other notable one in this context would be William Lloyd Garrison's non-resistance movement, which was directly how Thoreau built his own sort of set of ideas about protest. Non-resistance meant that one must not oppose force with force. You did not. This was William Lloyd Garrison, Thoreau's friends, notably Bronson Alcott. Uh, any act of force should be. You simply do not participate in it. You don't resist it. So, don't pay your taxes, don't join the military, don't vote even. These were all seen as deployments of force. So this was Thoreau's background. He stopped paying his taxes, his specifically, not all his taxes, but specifically the tax that you had to pay in order to vote, a poll tax, which he thought was an exertion of force on the part of the state and was the intersection between state force and individual choice. And so he protested by not paying his taxes, and famously was corralled one day by the tax protester, and he refused to pay up. And so the tax collector put Thoreau in jail, and his family got all in an upset, paid the tax that evening, and Thoreau was let out of jail the next day. It was a town scandal. I mean, you didn't do this, and it's the most trivial act of protest. I mean, some others had been threatened with jail. Thoreau was the first to actually get, locked up. But I mean, in a small town, Concord, Massachusetts, this had everybody talking, and Thoreau was called all sorts of names, juvenile delinquent and, worse. So he sat down to justify
Can
and
I
think through
clarify
and
something,
justify his
Laura?
actions. Sorry?
I just wanted to ask a point of clarification. That's fascinating.
Sure.
I didn't realize that Thoreau was a tax protester.
Hmm.
What was he?
That's
Did
the
he
origin,
disagree
yeah.
with the power of taxation generally, or for a
No,
particular policy that the government was
no,
using the
no.
taxes for?
He says in civil disobedience, he's quite clear. He says, "I'm happy to pay the highway tax. I use the highways all the time. These common taxes." But no, it was specifically the poll tax because it was the sense was the state policy against slavery, against the Mexican War, against the policies against the genocidal policies against Native Americans. Those are the three causes that he listed. That his point of power of where the state force was intersecting with his rights was specifically the poll tax. Um, yeah, interesting question, but no, he's educational taxes, highway taxes, other forms like fine, great. Um, so this was
That's
the point of resistance when it came to trying to explain to his townsfolk why he took this action. He wrote what became known as civil disobedience under the title Resistance to Civil Government. And the point there, I don't know if we have time for me to read a
no, go
sentence or
ahead.
two.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, absolutely.
So, okay. So, a couple of moments that are sort of like highlights of a very long essay. He writes and spoke to his townspeople in a lecture. It is not a man's duty as a matter of course to devote himself to the eradication of any, even the most enormous wrong. He may still properly have other concerns to engage him, but it is his duty, at least, to wash his hands of it, and if he gives it no thought longer, not to give it practically his support. If I devote myself to other pursuits and contemplations, I must see at least that I do not pursue them sitting on another man's shoulders. I must get off him first, that he may pursue his contemplations too. So this sense that you had to survey your environment and understand at what point, your decisions, your choices were resting on, in effect, another man's shoulders. And so it is a kind of individual soul searching. When it comes to more again state policies or larger um, again resistance, and you can hear the difference. He did mean resistance, not non-resistance. Um, if the injustice that you're facing is part of the necessary friction of the machine of government, there's that machine analogy again, engines and machinery. Let it go, let it go. Perchance it will wear smooth. Perhaps the machine will wear out. But if it is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then I say break the law. Let your life be a counter friction to stop the machine. What I have to do is to see at any rate that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn. There's
Can I
much more,
pause you
but that gives you
there?
the shape of it. Yeah.
Because this is fascinating, and I think it aligns really in an important way with sort of the work that we do at the R Street Institute. We believe in free markets, limited but effective government. There are
Mhm.
lots and lots of things that our government is involved in that I disagree with. And I'm
Right.
curious, both you, Laura, and Ilya and Jill, how we square that tension between our individual conscience and democratic decision making, because I recognize that I am
Mhm.
part of a larger democracy. and I'm not going to
Yeah.
always get what I want. And I may express that dissent through an op-ed. Maybe I'll go to a rally, but how do we sort of handle that tension between what we believe in at an individual level and what the state does and how the democracy operates?
I would say, sort of most urgently for Thoreau, the point would be the temptation and perhaps the normal course of business is to simply go along, um, whether or not you agree or disagree, but just to yield because it's inconvenient to do anything else. And Thoreau would hesitate, would stop you right at that moment and say, again, there's a selection process. If it's part of the normal friction, then you can't get out there in front of everything you don't like. But on the other hand, if there is like that machine to create injustice, an actual function of government that deliberately hurts people unjustly, that's when you've got to get out in front of it. And the other element of that is even if you choose to go along with things you disagree with, don't just slide into it. Think about it. Make a conscious choice. Now, he's not going to argue with you about the choice you make so much as he'll say, you darn well better be thinking this through. And if you choose, like, we just had tax day last month. If you choose to pay your taxes, don't just unthinkingly, sign off to the IRS. Do it with your eyes wide open.
Hmm.
And if you
Yeah.
choose to pay them, okay, but don't just slide into this. And so I think that's the principle. Thoreau is, I think, he's not a revolutionary. He's a dissenter, a dissident. And in that sense, the individuality of his stance plays into the question that, like, okay, this is my decision, but what about you? And the
Hmm.
you is, in his vision, becomes community very quickly because he's speaking to his townspeople because he's saying, I've thought about these things. This is what I decided, but now I want you, each of you, and I want us all together as a community to think about them. So this isn't individualist, which is the big misimpression. Civil disobedience only works if it's just one guy, one woman. I mean, it goes nowhere. It has to cascade into the community to be effective. And that's exactly what Thoreau is
Well,
insisting
that
on.
ties into the founding because it was a group of Englishmen who finally, you know, this was the last straw, and they eventually enumerated their complaints about the King
Mhm.
of England and said, yeah, every now and again in the course of human events, we have to throw off the
Right.
chains of oppression and form a new government to secure our liberties. And political theorists will say, well, that government's based sort of on consent theory. Now, I'm an immigrant, so I guess I consented, but people born into it, there's not like even when you turn 18, you don't sign a piece of paper saying, okay, I consent or I don't, right?
Right.
So there's other theories of legitimacy based on effectively due process. Have you had the opportunity to have your voice heard? Is
Yeah.
the government acting arbitrarily, whether ultimately it's a good or bad policy? This is why we have checks and balances, because if you go through these processes, then even if you disagree, it's legitimate because, after all, no government can act with, everybody in the community, let alone 300 million people in the modern United States,
Yeah.
agreeing on every single policy. The kind of other side of that coin is the more the government does, the more people are going to disagree with more of its policies. And so the greater the scope of governmental action, the greater a risk of illegitimacy.
Mm.
Yes. And I think it's a good transition. Jill, I want to bring you in here because, and sort of jump forward to some contemporary, more contemporary issues. Over the past decade, we've seen protests become more decentralized. They're rapidly mobilized. They're shaped by social media. Just looking back since the pandemic, since 2020, we've had the
Mm.
George Floyd, Black Lives Matter protests. We've had the Women's March. We've had No Kings protests. We've had the March for Our Lives protests. These are large, very diffuse protests, right? And I'm just curious how that transformation has happened, and not just how they operate, but how are they perceived today by the public?
So honestly, it's changed almost everything about how protest works on the ground. And the deeper change, I think, is that it's really expanded who can show up. So protest, it used to be a lot of like organizing, pre-planning, hanging flyers, do phone chains and get people there. Today, like you just said, like one flashpoint, one horrific thing that happens, it could push thousands of people into the streets within a few hours. And a lot of those people would have never come to a traditional movement meeting. So that's a real it's a real democratization of dissent. And I think we should name that as genuinely a good thing. But that comes with trade-offs. Movements often show up in public spaces before they've built the internal structure to sustain themselves or stay disciplined. The lack of central leadership in a lot of the movements we've been seeing, it makes it harder to suppress and more adaptive, but it also makes them harder to negotiate with. It makes them harder to hold accountable, and it makes it really vulnerable to being defined by their most disruptive protesters or participants. So, looking at it like from my policing perspective, it's a huge operational shift. There's often no organizer to coordinate with, no permit holder, because these things just pop up like really quickly, and there's nobody that you could call the recognized voice or the face of the movement. Then there's the perception piece, which is also huge. Every protest is filmed by a dozen angles right now. Any single moment, whether it's an act of violence, a clash with the cops, a really powerful image, it could come to define the whole movement in the public mind. And that cuts both ways. It cuts against the protesters and it cuts against law enforcement. So a movement of 10,000 peaceful people can get reduced to the actions of just 10. And that's a real problem for how the public processes what they're seeing. So institutionally, I think we're still catching up. Our legal frameworks, our policing doctrines, our political responses, they were built for an earlier model of protest. So the work ahead is really figuring out how we honor robust dissent while still operating in this new and evolving environment.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it goes along with what you were saying to us earlier this week, Laura, when we talked. You mentioned that the WTO protests, for example, were a movement that had a lot of momentum until it didn't. Maybe you can share a little bit about what happened there and what it tells us about how quickly that legitimacy can be lost.
Um, you were directing that to me. Sorry, I was
Yeah,
thinking
yeah.
about
I
something
just remember
Jillian
you
said.
were, yeah,
Yeah,
you were
yeah, no,
talking
that just
about that. Yeah.
yeah, no, my mind was going 100 places with that. Jillian, I think your work is really exciting. Okay. Um, One of the anchors, and I think this is still true. I've been fascinated by the fact that Thoreau, okay, so he titled it this piece originally Resistance to Civil Government. And, the word civil there being so important. This is for a civil state. And of course, yeah, he's writing, this is before the Civil War, very different kind of social political environment. And yet, right to our own moment, you still have this continuing relevance and power an appeal of that document, which then he retitled at the end of his life Civil Disobedience. So now we've got the phrase and we've got a handle, and people pick up on that readily and start to move forward with it. So famously, Gandhi found civil disobedience, when he was in South Africa, and said, I've been trying to articulate exactly these kinds of principles. This is very helpful, coming from a Western thinker, an American. So he starts adapting Thoreau's ideas and tactics into his larger project of satyagraha and, breaking away from the British colonization for Indian independence. Martin Luther King Jr., same thing. He finds Thoreau's civil disobedience as a college student and says, that I can use this. These are tactics and strategies that are useful to my campaign for civil rights. The interesting difference there is that King and Gandhi were speaking as leaders of movements, or as, talking Julian's sense that, this leaderless, it's diffuse. How do we manage this kind of new form of protest is really interesting, because with King and Gandhi and so on, leaders of movements speak as representatives of people oppressed by power structures. They've got a cause, they're leading a movement. In that sense, they are revolutionaries, not just dissenters. Thoreau is white and male, and he's a voter, and he's a citizen, he's privileged. He speaks as part of part of the state, part of the force, the power structure, even as he's dissenting from it. So he's modeling a different position within society, but both of them insist on that word civil, not as being nice or polite, although they do mean peaceful. But Martin Luther King is trying to, in a sense, that sense of getting out in front of the police or the state to create a crisis, right?
Hmm.
Something provokes. And Thoreau is just saying he's not trying to create a crisis or stage anything. He's just saying, look, these things happen all the time. So Thoreau isn't asking us to march out into the streets.
Hmm.
Martin Luther King did and was.
Do you think it's fair to say that one of the defining sort of characteristics of successful dissent or successful protest then is some discipline, right? That you can't
Yeah,
allow it to just
yeah.
sort of run off on its own.
More important than ever. I mean, this whole sense. My husband was in WTO here in Seattle, and he watched, what was it, 10,000 people peacefully marching back in 1999, and then the police came in, and he said that was pretty terrifying. But then the anarchists came in, and the only thing anybody remembers about that sort of landmark protest was the anarchists who came in and started smashing windows and vandalism and so forth. And so the sense of like the hopefulness lost and as the discipline is lost, and it all literally goes to smash. And then you're left thinking, well, we're voiceless now. How can you register a protest
And I think,
without?
Ilya, this goes to what you have talked a lot about, which is sort of this constructive versus destructive dissent and this idea of the heckler's veto. Maybe you can expand on that a little bit for our
Yeah,
audience.
Well, I mean, I think this goes more into Jillian's work, the idea that perhaps counterintuitively, nonviolent protest, civil disobedience is more effective than using force because effectively it uses the sense of justice and the sense of shame of the people you're trying to change against themselves, rather than kind of doing things that the vast majority of people who aren't on either side might make them turn against you. But the idea of the heckler's veto is simply that speech, the right to freedom of speech, is not a free for all. I mean, it can be in certain forums, like the traditional one that's invoked is in London, Hyde Park Speaker's Corner, where people literally get up on soapboxes and speak their mind about whatever, and people can shout at them and they can shout back, and it's just literally a free for all. If you are a student organization reserving a space for a speaker to hold an event, that's not a free-for-all. The law calls that a limited public forum. Someone coming in and trying to shout over the speaker, that's not just counter speech or more speech or a marketplace of ideas. That is the heckler's veto.
mm,
Sometimes it gets more violent. It's the violent
Yeah.
heckler's veto, or you get these things like, well, we can't host that speaker because we can't afford the security. That's a kind of veto as well. That is not free speech countering free speech. That is, again, unless you're talking about this field or park or public area where everybody can be and anybody can say whatever. In other places, there are rules and regulations that shutting down someone else's speech, whether through by being loud and disruptive or whether by threatening violence, that is the heckler's veto.
And it seems like certainly we see this on our college campuses right now, but also I think what Professor Walls was saying about the WTO protest is that you have a protest that is legitimate, and then you can have people who come in and undermine the legitimacy of that by being destructive and violent, and it no longer you can no longer have a productive form of dissent. So lots of ways in
I
which
don't know.
this.
I don't know whether legitimate is the right way to describe it. Uh, there are even before the anarchists came, there were different arguments on different sides of what the WTO was doing and globalization and trade
yeah.
rules and all of that. Are they legitimate points of view? Sure, but it's maybe I don't know what the word would be, but a protest that is organized or focused or something like advancing the ball, whether you agree with the direction that ball is supposed to be going or not, versus, yeah, anarchists by definition are just break it all down.
Right, right. Well, for those of us who are not in the tear it all down or burn it all down camp, sort of at our street, we talk a lot about how a healthy republic depends on multiple channels of participation. So you have protests, you have elections, you have persuasion. We do a lot of writing and media and things like that. Jill, when those channels feel out of sync, and when people are losing faith in our institutions, does protest become more volatile or more centralized? What do you see happening on the ground?
So honestly, I think it's both. And that's a lot of what makes this moment so difficult. When people lose faith in institutions, when they don't believe elections are delivering like responsive government that they want, when they don't trust the courts to rule fairly, when they don't trust police, when they think the media is captured or the legislature is just gridlocked, protests stop being one channel among several. For a lot of people, it becomes the channel, it's the default. And
Mhm.
that's where when it becomes more volatile. So protest is a vital channel, but it was never designed to carry the full weight of democratic participation on its own. When it becomes the primary outlet, a few things happen. Demand gets bigger because protest is being asked to do more. Tactics escalate because incremental gains start to feel insufficient. And then the line between protest and confrontation, it actually gets thinner. So at our street, we think a lot about how a healthy republic really depends on the whole ecosystem working together. So there elections, like you said, courts, legislatures, civil society, and protest. They're meant to complement one another. When one channel atrophies, the others get overloaded. So the answer to volatile protest isn't usually more restriction on protest. It's restoring confidence in the other channels so protest can do what it does best.
Yeah, absolutely. This is definitely a question that we're thinking a lot about. It's not just, we've done a lot of diagnosing lately that there's this lack of trust in our institutions, but what happens? What does a American liberal democracy look like without confidence in those institutions? And I think we're seeing some of that. Um, I feel like sometimes we're also thinking a lot about sort of pluralism. One of the we live here in I live here in Washington. It's one of the wonderful parts about living here, but it's also complicated, right? We joke all the time about the drivers in Washington from every state and every country around the world. It's chaos sometimes, but that's sometimes how the country can feel, right? We are a pluralistic society, and I'm just curious to hear from each of you sort of how a healthy democracy navigates competing forms of dissent, especially in our day and age.
Mm.
Well,
Yeah.
the founders certainly contemplated this. The Madisonian answer is to channel it through various ways to achieve the change that you seek, whether it's um, at the municipal, state, federal level, because we divide up power, or whether within the federal government you need to sue someone or sue the government, whether you want to ask your congressman to introduce a bill, whether you want to get some sort of regulatory change, and so you comment on the process of new rules being made. And of course, these days, most of the rules by which we live our daily lives, at least at the federal level, are produced from the bureaucracy, from the regulatory state, not from Congress. Um, and so, as long as you have that input, as long as you have that channel, as you were saying, Sabrina, the system works. But if those mechanisms break down and people feel frustrated and say that, well, nothing I do within the system makes a change, no, it doesn't matter which party I even vote for, that's when you get decline of public trust in institutions. That's when you get populism and kind of rule by the mass rather than by these checks and balances and the theory of legitimacy that I laid out earlier.
Mhm. We have several questions. Jill, Laura, if you wanted to jump in there, that's fine. Otherwise, I
Sure.
have a lot. Go
Let
right
me
ahead.
raise one of
Yeah.
the issues that worries me a lot as an educator and a citizen. Thoreau, again, going back to that fundamental sort of founding moment of a logic of individual protest. uh, Thoreau appeals to not just his individual conscience, as in you should search your conscience, but he also appeals, and this is the strength of civil disobedience, to a wider ethical conscience that is shared. And of course, you can't have a shared ethical conscience without a shared culture of thinking through and teaching. What do we believe in as a people? So, what is the foundation of our faith in each other, in whether we're religious or whether we're secular, that kind of bonding that creates a community, and without a sense of there being a shared reality, a shared truth, something that we can say, well, we have all of these disagreements, but we all are anchored here, and to have lost that anchor in the most fundamental of ways. I mean, now we've got medical sciences discredited, science, scientific research in controversial fields, so-called controversies like climate change, or vaccinations. Uh, Fill out that list. Without a kind of shared institutional mode of settling these things, we can stand firm on, and therefore we can start building a even in our disagreements, a world in common. It feels like the rails have come off, and now we're just free floating, and it's like, who shouts the loudest, who throws the biggest bombs. That's not even populism. That's I don't know what to name it, but that's really frightening.
Yeah. Jill, anything before we move into questions that you want to add there?
No, actually, I was looking at the questions because I was gonna start answering them, but I'll let you do that.
Yeah, I'm going to start with one that I think is interesting. One of our audience members has asked, what would Thoreau think about January 6th?
Well, um, Thoreau would not have been um, what invade. He would not have been pounding policemen with flagpoles and threatening to hang the vice president. Ah, what would he think about it? Thoreau would he, one of this problems for Thoreau scholars is how to go from the nonviolence of search your conscience and civil disobedience, which would have looked on to January 6th with horror, right? In any side of that conflict, and the Thoreau of 1859 with John Brown and the violence that John Brown said. I don't know if you quick background. John Brown, opposed to slavery, famously murdered several slave owners in Kansas, and tried to incite a slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry. And Thoreau, and then was captured and tried and executed for treason against the state. Thoreau supported John Brown and supported that incitement to rebellion on the basis that the situation in the United States had gone so far that moral reasoning and searching your conscience was no longer sufficient. There were millions of slaves, all of them in danger of their lives. The violence, the state violence had gone so far that the only way to resist was, and basically he started invoking just war theory. You had to protect these people. And violence could only be met in this situation by defensive violence. So I think he would have looked at January 6th and said, that does not meet the standard. That is not justifiable violence. That is simply, I don't know what he would have called it, but he would not have supported January 6th, and I think he would have looked a lot like a law and order person. if he'd been called on to make a statement. This was not the beginning of the Civil War.
Right.
I
Let me
think
ask
this,
another one. Oh, go ahead, Ilya.
I mean, on that point, it's especially in our time of what Jillian talked about, how you don't need organizers, that um, you know, a tweet or just spread of information can generate, people coming to this to the streets. If someone actually believes that, a world historical injustice is happening, and that an election is being stolen, and people are complicit in various nefarious conspiracies. The only thing that they have to do is to, take back their country. If that is what you have become convinced to believe, you know, if you think that someone is literally Hitler, right? And you feel, wouldn't it be your duty to kill that person, right? So this comes to, the spread of information these days, critical
Mhm.
thinking skills, all of these, complex social psychology. So, we can look back in retrospect at January 6th in a certain way, but I think it's more complicated about how the spread of information through society, and confirmation bias, and our geographical sorting by political opinion, all of these latent trends contributed to that day.
And I'll add that that is something that we talked a lot about actually at our event last November, if anyone's interested in watching it on political violence, because when you demonize your opponent over and over again, and both sides do this, then you sort of give permission. It's a permission structure to, of course, you have to overturn that. You have to dissent in a sometimes violent fashion. So I encourage people to check that panel out. Let me read a few more of these. We have someone who has asked, what do you say to people who believe protesting is not effective unless it's disruptive? For example, blocking traffic or protesting a speaker during an event, for example. How truly impactful is peaceful protest? What are some examples of that impact? Jill, I think this is right up your alley.
Yes, it actually really goes to the heart of the piece that I wrote that I believe Luke might have put in the chat. So, the core findings from this is decades of research. I literally went back and was looking through all of the historians who analyze protests, movements, and it's hard to assess like how something's impactful or how something's successful. But the point is that nonviolent movements are more than twice as successful as violent ones at achieving their stated goals. Again, subjectively, most of us or people that go to protests, like they want society to agree with them. Like that's the point, because you are hoping to evoke some kind of change. So this is all to say that it's not like a checklist, like did we get A, did we get B, did we get C, but it's how many people did we persuade to be on our side and think that what we're fighting for is just and reasonable. And one of the biggest issues where protests are becoming ineffective or seemingly ineffective is when you do have those few bad actors, those few individuals who they're not even really there for the movement, they're not there seeking change, they are disruptors, and they draw a lot of attention and focus away from the core message of the movement or the protest. So again, I think that understandably people think if you make a scene and you break windows and you have, all cameras on you and all eyes on you and lots of cops there, you're doing something positive. On the contrary, it's really hurting what the core foundational movement's all about.
Can I ask a question in response? So I'm thinking as I'm hearing this, the kind of yeah, mass protests, turn people out in the streets and so forth, as versus the kind of thing we all saw happening in Minneapolis with ICE, and the parallel was often drawn, and it's a just parallel. Thoreau was active on the so-called Underground Railroad. After the Fugitive Slave Law was passed, it forced every citizen of the United States, which implicated Thoreau and his family, to turn in any black person to the state, because any black person was judged to be, by definition, a fugitive slave, and that person should be remanded back into slavery, into the custody of their master. And so there were a number of cases in Boston after the law passed 1850 where Bostonians or people in Thoreau's circle refused and tried to release from prison Black individuals who'd been captured under the fugitive slave law, which was federal law, and it was a law with real teeth. So this was very risky for them. And so they organized the Underground Railroad, and Thoreau was one of the conductors. So you just, silently, without creating any kind of fuss or demonstration, you simply removed those, people in danger. You took them out of their situation of endangerment and made sure they got safely up to Canada. Um, you can see the parallels with ICE trying to warn and protect individuals who are being singled out by ICE. And this is not a case of kind of turning thousands of people out on the streets, but of warning, the 10 or 12 or 15 people in a very localized area, hey, come out right here, right now, and get these people out of danger, or at least put your bodies in front of them so that ICE has to, we start creating a spectacle. That's a that strikes me as a very different kind. And Julie, I'm just wondering how you react when you compare. One is protest, one is civil disobedience.
Yes. So that's to me, it's like where does it change from
Mm,
protesting or, standing up for what you believe in and doing it in like a civilized way, and then
yeah,
and it can graduate to this disobedience. And I think so as a cop, I obviously, if someone broke the law, you broke the law. And that, it's very black and white in that sense. And if you did anything, destruction, vandalism, violence, even though you were doing it because you may have felt it was morally justified, you still broke a codified law. And therefore you were arrested. But I do see the parallel that you're making. Like in Minneapolis, there were people that were, in their mind, they were doing this out of protection. It was protest, but protection because they believed that what the government was doing was intrusive, was illegal, was immoral, unjustified, etc. But once it becomes that situation where other people, other citizens in that area, they're at risk of their own personal safety, or there's destruction or vandalism, that's when it is perceived by outsiders, like watching that on TV, as those protesters seemed like they were agitating the situation. And that's us looking from outside in. I wasn't in Minneapolis. I didn't see what happened. But then we're also getting it fed by the news. And depending on which
right,
outlet you're reading, it's being completely construed in different ways depending on what channel you're watching that day.
right, right. Yeah, and the other principle of civil disobedience, of course, is that you are I mean, break the law, says Thoreau. I say break the law. So you know that you're breaking the law, and you know you stand the risk of getting punished for it, and you're willing to take that risk. Thoreau addresses people in the various people around him, saying, "Look, not everybody can do this." Gandhi said the same thing. Only a few people will take that step of breaking the law and putting their own lives on the line willingly to say, you will punish me, go ahead. And the very act of having the state punish me for for fighting for justice will create the spectacle that will alert other people to the misuse of power by the state and shame them shame the state, shame the democratic polity into realizing the wrongness of their actions. And you can see that acting in Minneapolis. But then the ambiguities start to proliferate as soon as you've got the TV cameras and the kind of, again, news media environment. Um, and then, when we have the killings of Alex Preddy and Renee Good, then the outrage takes on a life of its own. Uh, and people start questioning how much, to what extent are we still a democracy, right? Clearly we are. We're not Iran, as somebody pointed out on the news the other night, but it starts to look like, in your word, a real stress test.
Yeah, and as Jill said earlier, then it's a cycle that's out of balance, right? Because then we lose confidence in institutions, and then that generates more disruption. And then anyway,
Yeah.
um, Another question for everyone here is what do you think is more meaningful in addressing those structural reform discussions or trust in governance that Jill mentioned? Where is the happy medium between protest and dialogue?
I think one of the most important things is trust on both sides. Now, obviously,
Mhm.
protesters, whatever their focus is. So I'm just going to use policing protests because we've seen a lot more of that in the last several years. And it's police. I could tell you, I've been to so many protests as a cop, like standing on this side of the gate in my uniform and having to make sure that everyone that's there, they have their constitutional rights. They're asking, for change of whatever they are seeking. But at the same time, there has to be this mutual trust. We're there to protect the people who are protesting. We are there helping them live their constitutional right to do this. But if once they cross over that line with violence or disruption or making it to where it puts other people at risk, not just law enforcement, we're there for preservation of peace and to give people that platform to protest and feel safe. So I think one of the foundational things that we're missing right now, at least in the policing protest realm, is that mutual trust between the citizens and between the law enforcement, and then working together. We're not seeing that. And as Laura was just saying, I think one of the biggest issues with Minneapolis is the people that were out there who were protesting against ICE raids and were, in their mind, they were doing the right thing. They were protecting members of their community. But once it gets to that point where it becomes volatile, it becomes dangerous, there's a clear breaking of law. That is where those protesters, there will be consequence. Arrests is the consequence I think of, or summonses, or some form of, consequence by police action. But once we see people getting shot, people getting killed, that just makes this entire thing like what the law enforcement officers are doing. People are now seeing them as completely illegitimate. And that makes people, in their behavioral sense, once you deem something as not legitimate, you are more likely to fight against it. So again, it's cyclical. If we can't have
Yeah.
trust established and transparency in why law enforcement are doing what they're doing, we're never going to see anything work or anything be peaceful.
Well, I wonder if some of our previous protest movements, things like the labor movement, civil rights movement, women's suffrage, all sorts of things, were in some ways more effective because it was before we had mass media and mass
Yeah.
communication. And I'm curious everyone's thoughts on that. And were they more effective, or was it just simply a function of the
Yeah.
time had come?
I
They were
think they were clearly more effective. I get to vote.
yes, right. Me
My
too.
grandmother actually got to vote, at a certain point in her life. So I worry about this all the time, exactly what you're saying. I mean, clearly they were effective in the past. We made, as a society, from Thoreau's day to, let's say, the end of the 20th century, extraordinary progress in social change in ways that really count. Um, and and the rise of social media, the kind of monetization of anger,
Mhm.
of division, is terrifying to watch because they don't see how to short circuit it, and sort of, except for again the local level. I think about what people take in through their screens, and then I walk out to our community, and I see a very different world. In the world of the communities, we're good to each other. We treat each other with respect. We have conflicts. We go to city hall. We argue things out. I mean, it's like a very different world where we can actually connect, and we're working together to make several good things happen, which makes me want to say, get off the damn screens.
Mhm.
Just stop doing that, which is not a solution. It's just a reaction.
I have sort of an anti-presentism bias, if you will, with this sort of thing, because so many people, when they protest, they think that they are like the protesters in the civil rights era, or the suffragettes, or the abolitionists, or these kind of world historic great causes. And I think we're privileged to live at a time where, yes, we have important political disagreements and challenges, but not rising to the level of tens of thousands of young American men being sent to fight in a war that might not be considered popular, or segregation by race, or all of these just huge things. Maybe the closest thing that comes to modern time is the pro-life movement, which was handled very differently. An annual march for life and things like that, and eventually changed through the courts. But there's a lot of what sometimes been called Selma envy, or kind of thinking that part of going to college, this is a very kind of elitist sort of perspective, but part of the college experience is reliving the era of the hippies and the Vietnam War protesters and things like that. And sorry, the issues now are simply not like that, at least from my perspective.
Let me get to one more question. We have a question that intellectual protest and civil disobedience based on moral principle is one element that has stayed woven into the current opposition fabric. But now we have paid protests and professional protesters that, when asked, don't even have a coherent answer for what they are opposing. Can we discuss this in the same way, or is this distinguishable?
Hmm. Well, I would certainly think they're distinguishable. Again, going back to Thoreau's, you may properly have other things you want to do with your life, but when it intersects with when your choices start to harm another person, that's when you have to draw the line. And of course, this goes into all sorts of, well, we're surrounded with questions that involve our choices, and compromises are inevitable. So exactly where do you say, I will have to bend, I have to buy gas to fill my car to drive somewhere. I hate this because I'm a climate activist and I don't want to have to fly to New York for the climate conference, but that's the only way to get to New York, so I'm compromising, etc.
Mhm.
At what point is compromise intolerable? So, in that sense, the act of going out and becoming just sort of a kind of professional protester, by any means, Thoreau would say you've created a machine for moral outrage. That's taken a life function, and hived it off in isolation, and no longer in touch with real life, with deep issues that we need to be facing, whether individually or communally or as a nation.
And Laura, I will say that that question actually, kind of resonated with me because we've been speaking so much internally about the use of AI and how this changes
Hmm.
our decision making, and especially when it comes to your values and when you choose to dissent and when you don't. And I feel like it's worth flagging that our executive director, Erica Schroeder, had an interview that's out today about just this, and that what's different between, you may have a digital twin, an AI that can make decisions on your behalf. It can be a hired dissenter, right? But the difference between that and a human is that we are able to sort of make those trade-offs and determine and consider the weight of a decision. And I think that comes to bear when we're talking about dissent and we're talking about protests. We as humans are able to consider that reputation and the relationships that are involved, and what the consequences will be. So I think that's sort of a timely question. I'd love to close with some optimism. We've spent the afternoon tracing, quickly 250 years of dissent. Let's go around. I'd like to know what gives each of you hope that America can still get this right.
Hmm. I'll start. I have I moved fairly recently back home to Seattle, and live north of Seattle now in a community called Edmonds. And we have some good local leaders. They're thoughtful, they're engaged, They model the kind of good civic behavior that one would love to see. I came from South Bend, Indiana, where we had a mayor who became quite famous, Pete Buttigieg, and I watched him get elected and then reelected, and I watched him work to do, a lot of, again, locally powerful things. And so when you engage on that community level and realize that the world that you actually live in is amenable to change. People around you will gather up and help you make change, that you can actually do things that are effective. And no, they won't solve the national problem. But on the other hand, this is the immediate world we live in. And time and time and time again, when I engage in whatever community projects concern us, I come back thinking, I live in an absolutely wonderful world surrounded by extraordinary people who are dynamic and thoughtful and caring and passionate and smart. And what a privilege it is to be here and to be alive today. Um, and that gives me hope. That is the source of hope.
That's great. Ilya, what are your thoughts?
I have four little kids, four under 10, and so just looking at them, it forces me to be hopeful because the alternative is just not acceptable. And I just recognize, and again, this might be the immigrant in me, double immigrant. I was born in Russia, we then came to Canada, and I enjoyed immigrating so much I had to do it again. I mean, America remains the land of opportunity. It remains very wealthy. It remains, with higher birth rates than any country other than Israel in the industrialized world, which is saying something. People still want to come here, not other places. Um, there's a lot of good going on, and you know, uh, I like Calvin Coolidge a lot for many things, and one of his insights was sometimes you just muddle through. And I mean, he once said, if you have 10 problems, take a nap, and by the time you wake up, nine of them will have fallen by the side of the road. So I think there is some. I don't know whether it's on Walden Pond meditative sort of nexus with that as well. But sometimes my wife reminds me you just have to chill.
It's probably a good
It's
message.
very Walden Pond.
Yeah. Jill, any final thoughts?
So a few things give me hope because I've gotten to work so many protests. I know most protests are actually very peaceful. Most people are going there with good intentions in their heart, and most of the institutions of government that are there to keep them safe are also acting professionally, very courteousful, and also they are trying to make sure that everyone there is remaining safe. So that gives me hope knowing that only the bad stuff makes the news, and that's what we're talking about today. But most of the time, these things are very peaceful, and that's a good thing. The other thing is, I like research and I like statistics. It's what I live for. And statistically and research oriented minds know that most protests are, again, very peaceful. So the records of them across the decades that we're talking about, they kind of speak for themselves. And then I think another thing that gives me hope is the fact that we can have a candid conversation like this right now. And so knowing what is going on in the world and having people of different different mindsets come together and just talk about it openly, I think that gives me a lot of hope.
That's great. And I will add that, at our street, one of the things we talk a lot about is civic responsibility. And that is a think tank where we, in many ways, are offering dissenting sort of viewpoints all the time. We see ourselves not only in advancing those policy prescriptions, but also in strengthening our institutions and preserving our form of self-governance, which relies on dissent and relies on protest. So I feel like hopeful in that we have organizations like the ones that we all work at that allow for that. Before we sign off, I just first want to thank all our speakers. Thank you so much for such a thought-provoking conversation. I want to thank everyone who joined us this afternoon. If you would like to revisit today's discussion or watch any of our earlier America 250 conversations, some of them were in person, but many were webinars, you can find them on our website under our America 250 conversations page, also on our YouTube channel. It's been a really wonderful year of conversations, and they're well worth exploring. And while this is our last virtual conversation in the series, it is not our last word on America 250. We hope those who are in the DMV will join us in person for a rooftop celebration at our offices on Wednesday, June 24th, to help celebrate this milestone together. We'll share more details on that soon, but save the date. And thank you again for everyone who joined us today. Take care.
Thank you all. Thank you,
Thank
Sabrina. Thank you,
you.
Ilian and Julian. I learned a lot. Appreciate it.